It was the exact description that Igor Burtsev had talked about with one of his witnesses in a Moscow garden. A curtain of light came down. She said pixelated, and it disappeared in this pixelations of light.
Welcome to A Flash of Beauty, the podcast, an audio experience dedicated to the further exploration of Bigfoot and the people Bigfoot has revealed itself to. What started with a documentary of eyewitness testimony and expert analysis has now led the film's crew deeper down the path to follow up with those whose lives are forever changed by this cloaked reality. Tune in weekly to join me, your host, Tobe Johnson, and my co-host, Jill Remensnyder, as we go back into the trees to sit down once more with our guest in search of the truth, no matter how strange. Well, hello. I have nobody else but myself here to greet you and say, my name is Tobe Johnson, and Jill Remensnyder is nowhere to be found. Oh boy, what am I going to do? Well, these things happen periodically when you do a podcast, and we're in one of those moments right now where a strange gremlin got inside the post-editing computer. And boy, oh boy, there's some weird stuff going on as far as reverb was concerned. With the last 5 minutes of our interview with Simeon Hein, there was all sorts of anomalies actually when we were interviewing him, including this would be the second time where we pick up what looked like little dusty orbs coming in and out of view. The only problem is that his dog was responding to them in the hotel. So those I can't cut out. But when it comes to the sound part of this, we wanted to make sure that this dark reverby thing that came in to the audio part of this for people that are just listening to this, that they weren't plagued by that. So again, our guest today is Dr. Simeon Hein, author of Dark Matter Monsters and his second edition of Black Swan Ghost, available now. You can go over to Dr. Simeon Hein at YouTube and find out more about him. Now, if you go back and watch A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot, you'll get an idea of what Simeon Hein theorizes going on with Sasquatch. Something very strange is occurring, and how this free energy basically evolved into something that can go from a static to a variable. That's the easiest, most condensed way I can put it. Of course, Simeon goes into a lot more detail about that. And we also get into the drone issue because it must be covered, because it is related somehow, some way with the cryptid issue. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've heard people describe strange lights, not all that just seem unconventional. Conventional lights. Black helicopters are also part of the Sasquatch thing. And I've heard people, witnesses, describe these strange lights as drones. Let's get into it with our guest here, Dr. Simeon Hein. With us right now is not only my co-host, Jill Remensnyder, but the great Dr. Simeon Hein. Hello, Simeon.
Hey guys, how's it going tonight?
Hi. It's so good to catch up with you. There's so much to talk
Yes,
about.
we're long overdue for a chat.
Yeah. Well, just to catch people up, if you haven't seen Simeon in A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot, Simeon is known best for his two bodies of work. Kind of how we found him was through his original book, Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptid Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Life Forms. And his latest book here, Black Swan Ghosts, a sociologist encounter witnesses to unexplained aerial craft, their occupants, and the other elements of the multiverse. It's a mouthful, but what we're about to discuss here doesn't maybe seem connected to the world of the cryptid or Sasquatch, but yet you found yourself going from the strange world of understanding things like relic neutrinos and this divergent life form that maybe has its own type of evolving state into the world of Sasquatch. So how'd you get here, Simeon?
Well, it's been a long, strange trip. That's all I'm going to say. Black Swan Ghosts, that was from 2017. That was before Dark Matter Monsters, but I revised it last July with new witness cases. So I released a second version, but in July of this year, 2024. But the original book was 7 years ago, right before that New York Times article came out about in December of 2017. Remember when they said that the Pentagon had these UFO programs and they talked about Skinwalker Ranch, right? And OSAP and ATIP. But I was getting the feeling that there was just something really wrong with our lack of discussion and knowledge of these topics. And so I said, I have to write about this. I've talked to so many witnesses. This is before I really knew anything about Bigfoot, Sasquatch. That didn't really start till about 2020, 2021, sometime around there. So how did I get here? Wow. I feel that it started with that sighting with my mom in the Everglades in when I was like 12 or 13. And it was a big amorphous yet solid object, green, hovering above us about a mile or two up, that as a young teenager, I just thought, what could that be? My mom was looking in it. We were in the Everglades. She was a bird watcher. She was looking in another direction, and I saw it, and it was bright, and I thought it had to be the moon. So I said to my mom, hey, look at that weird green moon. And then she looked over at the horizon because that's where the moon was. And then she went back to binocular. I said, no, Mom, you got to look. And she goes, the moon's over there. I said, well, what's that? She goes, Sim, it's a UFO. And we looked at it with binoculars, and then it just moved. It was totally stationary, like, don't look at me, I'm not here. And then it just started moving rapidly. That sort of instantaneous acceleration that these things sort of have, into a cloud, like it was hiding from us. Looking at it with the binoculars, it was like, it seemed that way. I don't know if that's what had happened, but synchronistically it moved exactly. Started looking at it. And guys, when my mom had good bird watcher binoculars, 10 power, that craft, the underside of it, there was detail in there. I knew immediately I wasn't looking at a cloud, a green cloud. It had dots and patterns, and it formed like a Z. And then it just faded away, and we went to the ranger talk. Tubbs, I think I talked about this at the Strange Days event when you asked me to give an introduction. So you've heard this before. But we went to a ranger talk. The power was out. We sat down next to people who had seen the same thing. We just said, hey, we just saw a UFO. And the people sitting on the bench said, yeah, we saw it too. We saw it kind of come out of a cloud. We saw it go back in. And then the ranger, said, well, what did people see today? Anyone want to share? So my mom really saw a UFO, and she goes, oh, really? Anybody else want to share anything? Like she wanted to gloss over it. So my mom always said that's when they zapped you that day. That's why you got interested in all these topics. So Tobes, I'm going to answer your question that way. It might have started there. Maybe that's how other civilizations meet us, is slowly they approach different people when they're infants and children. I don't know, but I do remember the feeling of that object, and it felt like it didn't belong here. That's all I can say. I didn't even know the word alien very much as a 12-year-old, but it felt alien. It just felt, the vibe of it didn't feel like it belonged to Earth. That's all I can say. So maybe that's where this started, my interest in these subjects. But as you know, I really didn't pursue this a ton, apart from reading a few books. John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies. I remember coming across that. And Carlos Castaneda, with the inorganic beings and this idea of other life forms, maybe kind of planted some seeds in there. And then years later, after going through school continuously all the way to statistics, sociology, I came across the idea of remote viewing. Someone was teaching a class in it, the Farsight Institute, and I was kind of skeptical but curious, and I took the class, and it showed me there was some real big body of knowledge that we hadn't talked about in school ever. And I'd never heard about psychic functioning or clairvoyance or precognition, all these things that come up with the topic of RV. And of course, there were people coming to take the class who had worked in the government just because it was kind of a hot topic after it was declassified in 95. The protocols were never classified, but the particular subjects were. It was run at a Defense Intelligence Agency, and then the CIA ran it for a while. They had names for it like Stargate and stuff like that. Yeah. And so that introduced me to this whole other world, which as a sociologist just was fascinating, that there are these hidden events, which are things going on that the mainstream society doesn't talk about, but yet you have this consistent string and stream of witnesses with very good credentials who are telling you this is real. And it opened me up to the idea around 1996 that somehow from kindergarten to PhD, I hadn't really been exposed to everything that was true. There were other topics out there that obviously mattered, classified programs, just this whole world of things that I had never heard about before.
And so going from crop circles to remote viewing to looking at a divergent life form that evolves on its own, how do you eventually get to the world of the cryptid and Sasquatch?
That is a very good question. Now, back in 1970s, I saw a preview in the movie theater. It was Bigfoot Update, it was called. It was when I was probably around the same age. And they showed the Patterson-Gimlin film. And it was like this sort of kind of pseudo, like before reality shows existed, it was like they were back up at Bluff Creek and they had these loggers and things. And, with chainsaws, and they say, hey, buddy, can you move over? We're filming some news clips here. And it was obviously staged, but they said this is where the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot. And I looked at that and I never heard about Bigfoot again after that. That film was all the way from 67, as you know. And here I'm looking at it and I was kind of wondering what Bigfoot was, and then we kept hearing on shows like Coast to Coast, Art Bell from cryptozoologist, that this was a very rare animal. It was some sort of ape, relic primate offshoot that you were very unlikely to encounter. Maybe there were 1,500 up in the Cascades somewhere, and that was it. And, just some ordinary animal, until what introduced me to it again was students in my RV classes, remote viewing in Colorado. These were Colorado natives who had encountered Bigfoot. And I heard these stories starting in the 90s. And it took me about 20 years to realize this mattered, because I'm kind of thick-skulled, just like anybody else. And I just thought, well, it's that rare ape that, Lauren Coleman talked about on Art Bell. I mean, I couldn't quite figure the significance of it. Maybe there were some rare animals out there we hadn't encountered, until I heard these descriptions of what it could do and what it was like to be around it. The very first one I heard was a woman that encountered it on her deck. Barb, I filmed it. She let me interview her and put it on my YouTube channel. And she described it projecting its mind into her mind as she was going to bed upstairs, and seeing its face, very detailed look at what its face is, kind of orangish, reddish hair, the expression on its face. And there was a witness downstairs, her roommate, one of her roommates. It was in the area called the Black Forest, northwest of Colorado Springs. Sort of back then in the 80s, would have been sort of like suburbs, rural, down from the Rockies there. And she said the roommate saw it and it looked exactly like what she had seen in her mind's eye. And she heard, ear-piercing howl. And she wasn't sure if it was coming in from her mind or if she actually heard it. But the roommate downstairs said she had heard it too and saw it through the French doors on the deck. It had jumped up on a deck and then jumped down, and she never got a chance to see it. But it was an RV connection. I mean, here we're doing an RV class, and I've got someone in the class saying I had this telepathic contact, verifiable telepathic contact, verified by the roommate, all the details that she saw in her mind's eye. So that was my introduction to it. But there were other people, a guy that had been camping by himself in high school just went up to a place called Netherland up from Boulder in the Rockies, and he had been pulled out of his tent in the middle of the night, and there were no other people around. There were no other campers, there were no other cars, and it was like he said, the G-forces were so strong from whatever was pulling him out of the tent. He was going like 20, 30 miles an hour, and he couldn't get out of the bag because he was scrunched up in the foot of the sleeping bag from the G-force being yanked out like that. And it really shocked him and kind of scared him. And he said when he screamed and when he popped his head out, there was nothing there. No people saying, hey, gotcha. No drunk campers, Bubba out there, so let's play a prank on this kid. Nothing like that. It convinced him Bigfoot was real, and other cases like that. So I heard about this over the years, and eventually, as I wrote about in Dark Matter Monsters, a friend gave me these Bigfoot socks from the Bailey Sasquatch outpost.
Nice.
And yeah, and so when I was going through Bailey once, I just said to a friend, let's go the other way. We were driving back to Boulder. Let's down this road. And there was this huge Sasquatch painted on the side of a building. We said, oh, that's the museum. I heard, let's go in. She didn't want to go in. She with museum, but I went in and saw the map of all the types of contact that Jim Myers had interviewed all these people personally, people who come through the museum. Every time they came through and said, oh, we saw footprints here. We heard howls over here. We had a sighting over here. And then most recently, they've had rocks thrown. That's a dot. That's a green dot or something like that. When I saw that map, guys, it was sort of like the scales fell from my eyes. All of a sudden, I realized this was a local topic. It wasn't what Lauren Coleman had told us way out in the Northwest and other cryptozoologists. It's just this thing in Washington or Oregon, and it's just isolated. It was happening up and down the Front Range, and the closest encounters were just right outside of Boulder, just at the edge of the parks there, all along those little towns, those mountain towns. And I realized, whoa, this is what my students have been telling me about, but there's case after case, and it's all over, right? Mm-hmm. Getting very close to Denver. So I realized this was happening locally, and I felt that connection, and I decided to look into it.
I don't want to hog the mic here. Jill, do you have a question?
Well, I have a comment. Okay. I just have to say, so Brett and I have been to the Sasquatch outpost, and we've spent some time with Jim Myers and stuff. And yeah, that's not far from Denver at all. And they're having incredible sightings and experiences. I guess, would you even call that suburb or bedroom community or whatever? But it's not that.
Yeah, Bailey is sort of up there. I mean, it's not quite the suburbs anymore. That would be a little closer in.
That's a stretch, but it's not that.
Not that far, maybe.
Drive. It was a quick commute.
Maybe an hour or so, under an hour. I mean, for me, for Boulder's an hour and 15 minutes. So from Denver, it'd be maybe 45. Yeah, that was the big, exactly right, Jill. It wasn't something that was way out in the mountains and, just occasional sighting and then it ran away. I mean, this was right there. This was in your face. And I realized, wow, this is what we've talked about with UFOs. We call it hidden events in sociology. It has a name. These type of phenomena. These are things that people are experiencing, but they're not talking about. And we know about this in sociology from the discovery of child abuse, which in the 60s became a real diagnosis for injured children. But before then, doctors didn't want to accuse parents of harming their kids. So they would do things like the same things like it had been done with UFOs, saying it was like, swamp gas or weather balloons, or Venus. They would say, oh, these kids fell out of trees. Maybe they got beaten up by a bully, or they have thin bone structure. That was a favorite explanation too. It was like just avoiding the topic completely. And so this is, in sociology, we know about this. These are sort of like social defense mechanisms because we don't want to accuse people in power of abuse because psychologically we want to believe that authority is just and fair and treats us well. So we don't want to accuse authority figures of misconduct, but that's what this came down to. So in the 60s, there were these meetings, these national meetings of authority figures, pediatricians, psychologists, radiologists with, the evidence from radiographs and so forth, x-rays, and law enforcement. They held two meetings in Chicago and then in DC, 65, something like this, 62. And they came to this conclusion suddenly that this was real, that parents were hurting their kids. I mean, some of these cases were actually child abuse, and it became a real term. And so that's what happens with topics like this, is they stay under the radar for a long time. All of a sudden it just erupts, and the paradigm shifts very quickly. And I think we're going to see it with these topics too, because as you have more witnesses, and your movies have done an excellent job. I look at the comments on YouTube and so forth of bringing people forward who say, hey, that happened to me too, right? And all of a sudden, it's not like the psychologists in Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed, where they say people forget about their encounters, right? Because it goes against the brain's defense mechanisms. It's uncomfortable to talk about with family members and friends because people are going to ridicule you. So you had those psychological professionals saying people don't even remember their encounters, which I've increasingly have a lot more evidence for just reading encounters and listening to podcasts. But it can invert, Jill. So all of a sudden it goes from being repressed to, I don't want to repress this anymore. I want to share it, because there are people out there who are empathetic to it. And you get this explosion of witness cases like I'm seeing now in the comment section of your videos when you put them online, and the various people who, when you have expanded interviews. And then I get in contact with these people, and then I start listening, and you realize this is another hidden event, just like UFO contact, cryptid Bigfoots are another part of that. Sometimes all at the same time, Bigfoot, cryptid, UFO encounters. That's Stan Gordon from Pennsylvania. But so this is how it happens. It starts with a little trickle, and then all of a sudden you get this real big change, acceleration, and it comes to the forefront.
Well, it's like in the interview we did, and I think we feature this in A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot. You kind of walk us through the connections of what Bigfoot experiencers and witnesses are encountering, how it overlaps with like
Right.
what people investigating crop circles, paranormal events, UFOs. So it's kind of like there is an umbrella where everything's connected.
Yes, that's a very good point, Jill. That's an excellent point. And I think that's what really got me going into this, is once the very first conference I went to was hosted by the Sasquatch Outpost at that lodge in Bailey. And it was called Russia, America, Bigfoot Research or something like this. And Igor Burtsev was there all the way from Russia. And he had been studying it for 50 years. He said in Russia, they call it hominology. And the biggest shock of my life was talking to witnesses there, listening to their experiences. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing and what people like Igor were sharing. This wasn't some ordinary animal at all. It wasn't even an animal. It was much closer to a human, if not a human that was just a lot older than us or evolved in a different direction. That's what Igor said they had concluded in the Soviet Union. It was a type of human. But the big but was, it was paranormal. That's exactly what Igor called it, paranormal. He said, first we thought it was like a relic ape, and then we thought it was a relic human, like some sort of Neanderthal that had survived through the ice ages, rare, still in the forests of Russia. But then we realized all the strange electromagnetic effects, the invisibility, the other types of PK effects that they experienced researching it, and its other abilities it had, the telepathic abilities, that it was sort of a paranormal human. And the people at the conference, I would talk to them and so forth, it's exactly what they told me, these other Colorado natives. The cameras had stopped working. They had something that they called brain fog, like it was projecting some sort of mental confusion onto them. Jim talked about their car batteries all not working at once after they had a sighting or something like this in that area. And I said, wait a minute, that's what we saw around crop circles. Our cameras going out, people having these weird time slips. And so it got me thinking, wow, is there like a greater umbrella that we call paranormal or supernatural that includes all these phenomena, which would indicate we're dealing with another type of reality construct, and these are entities that are part of that construct. In other words, we're coming up against another type of reality, and it has these symptoms every time. Well, a lot of the time, the sudden temperature changes, the kind of quiet, this sort of oppressive silence that seems to pervade an area before UFO encounters, cryptid, Bigfoot encounters, ghost encounters, the EM effects on cameras, watches, batteries, and so forth, the sense of time loss or displacement that's very challenging for the people who've experienced it. I've talked to people who've had those types of experiences, and other types of phenomena that seem to go along with pretty much everything we call paranormal, supernatural. So it gets you thinking, wow, are we dealing with another set of scientific principles that underlie all of these phenomena that we call supernatural, paranormal? And then when I started looking into cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction, which started about 2010, Fleischmann and Pons with their 89 experiment, University of Utah, they also get some of those effects too, sudden temperature changes, strange EM effects. The overlap was really hard to ignore. And those folks were calling what they were experiencing coherent matter, which includes ball lightning, orbs, and so forth, which is, of course, what people experience around Bigfoot, Sasquatch, various types of cryptids, ghost haunted sites, UFOs, and other scenarios where these strange anomalous lights, sometimes it's called, anomalous discharges, exotic vacuum objects, charge clusters. There was a real continuity between the phenomena that I could see. And as I said, and I often say, if you don't agree with this, if you don't want everything to be put under this umbrella, I'm fine with that too. But you kind of need to propose another paradigm that would explain why we see a lot of this. But for me, it just was hard to avoid seeing the similarities between these phenomena. And then in Flash of Beauty, you guys did such a good job bringing together all these different witnesses, some of them from the first movie. And if I'm not mistaken, you almost like you weren't planning on making the second movie, but these witnesses kept, they kept mentioning this. We've been told that Bigfoot researchers, the type that I might have known, Grover Krantz from WSU, and those initial researchers had such a hard time getting the subject even accepted. They didn't want to go in that direction. They would omit that sort of detail from their witness encounters and kind of sanitize it. So it ended up being this big relic primate Gigantopithecus, because that's in their minds. That's all they could, fathom at the time in the 80s, right? John Bindernagel and others. It had to be the great American wood ape, because that was a stretch, and they all suffered. They were all attacked by their colleagues or were ignored. Just suggesting that there was a wood ape out there that hadn't been identified. But this, if you look at the research, even going back to the Ape Canyon incident, 1924, they were talking about these supernatural effects, right? It's been there the whole time, and you look at the Native American lore, as you're doing again in a future movie. So you start seeing these patterns, and it becomes really interesting to see how it all connects.
I got a lot of questions here, Simeon, so I'm going to blow through a couple here, and we'll just get through them because I don't want to take up too much of your time here, but I keep writing down new stuff, Jill, so bear with me. These hidden events, as a sociologist, a lot of times, I heard a quote the other day that revolutions happen when expectations aren't met, i.e., a sudden thing that was expected to happen, like a good news, a new dawn, a golden age, and it's cut short. And this is when revolutions happen. Is something like that unfolding right now, where these hidden events have been stifled in the same way that the priests, stifled the sexual abuse?
That's an excellent point. I would say yes. This stifling of science and scientific evidence has been going on for quite a while, at least 70 years now. It really seemed to start with World War II, when the United States had to adopt these extreme national security measures because of the threat of Nazi Germany actually taking over the planet, which is one scenario that could have happened if a couple of those battles had gone another direction. And then the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The National Security Act is passed in 1947, and it really centralizes science. And as a lot of physicists have pointed out, Alexander Unziker, this German physicist who has a very good YouTube channel, and others, that was the end of theoretical exploration in physics. All these early, mind-bending questions that physics asked, quantum mechanics, particle wave duality, and the nature of quantum energy, the way it kind of comes in pulses rather than being continuous, quantization and so forth. And what is the structure of reality if it's really based on a wave-like pattern? Why does it even seem solid? And are there multiverses, which whoever proposed in 1957? Is this the solution to the Schrodinger equation? Is that there all these realities stacked on each other and we're just in one at a time? Which is something that you could really consider for a while in terms of explaining how people have experiences with these phenomena, parallel realities, right? And so that all really came to the end, and it became what some people have called shut up and calculate, because the US government became really concerned about building bigger bombs, because the Soviets were building bigger and bigger bombs. And it became this Cold War, this arms race that we all grew up with, right? And that meant really huge funding organizations, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, CDC, and these other kind of vast federal bureaucracies, which now took over the mantle of funding big science. And when you have big science, you don't go against it because you're not going to get your grant money. Everything was built around these grants. And you didn't have these scientists working on their own anymore. It all had to be in concert with federal grant giving agencies that worked with universities. You guys came out to WSU to film. Those sorts of universities were completely dependent on federal funding. I think maybe half of their funding comes from federal sources. So, and I know about this because I worked with the administration on some point about some of this funding, just using statistics to try to look at where the funding was coming from and so forth. So I got to kind of see this from the inside. So this heavy dependency on centralized federal science agencies really discouraged going off into branches of other topics that in the past we would have had a lot of different scientists, a lot of different Galileos and Copernicuses and so forth, and Keplers and Faradays and Maxwell's, studying anomalies and just working and coming up with electromagnetism and all these new ideas, right? I mean, there's always been resistance to new ideas, but now the US really doubled down on it. And it really killed any research into these fascinating areas of coherent matter and condensed matter physics, which the Soviets and the Chinese kept working on in their remote viewing programs, their psychokinesis programs. I mean, there were 20 KGB agencies devoted to our programs devoted to remote viewing. And I'm told 5 big ones in China. We just had a small one, at Fort Meade, and then at SRA in Palo Alto. But even those folks were really, often attacked. So there was this stigma against all of this, what we're talking about, all of these types of topics that didn't fit in the mainstream. And Vannevar Bush, who was rumored to be on the MJ12 group, which was this majestic 12 group, the secret organization of 12 people behind UFO studies and research in the federal government. Vannevar Bush even wrote a book warning us that centralized science, of the Bush family, warning us that centralized science could kill creativity and initiative. And I think we saw that happen because there's a lot of evidence for all the topics we're talking about here tonight. Witnesses after witness. So yeah, to go back to your question, I mean, it was really suppressed for a long time, and it's worse than that. They developed disinformation programs. The Robertson panel said in 1953 that there could be mass panic if there were all these objects seen in the sky, which we're actually seeing in the past couple of weeks. And it could cause people to panic. So we'd have to make fun of it and say that it was, misidentified meteors, swamp gas. Take your pick of the explanation of the month. The New York Times article in 2017, I mean, they said maybe it was, the critics said maybe it's stress, pilot stress, and they're always just focusing away from the evidence. So there was deliberate programs in the US, even kind of amping up the kind of conformity that we feel in the US that's sort of like an American trait in some ways, to kind of fit in. I mean, we only have two political parties. Look, in Europe, there's lots of different parties. I'm not saying it's the wrong system. I think it's like Winston Churchill said, it's the least worst of all the bad ones, But so it really squashed, I think it squashed any serious scientific discussion of any of these topics, be it parapsychology, remote viewing, psychic functioning, cryptids, non-ordinary life forms, unexplained flying objects, unidentified processes, extending all the way to low energy nuclear reaction. It just cast up this pall on this whole range of subjects. But the cool thing is, it's all coming back now. You can't hold back reality. So you push it away for 70 years, and now we'll have 70 years of it all coming out. All the witnesses, all the people who've experienced this, and we've got the internet, so we've got podcasts, and we've got YouTube shows like yours, movies, and it's like this. It went way back into the dark ages, and now it's like a rubber band, like snapping forward after being pulled back like a slingshot. That's the way I see it. So you can hold this back for a while, but you can't hide from reality. And if people are experiencing these phenomena, which they do, and I've talked to so many people about all these different types of phenomena, be it Bigfoot or their UFO encounters, and I've seen it myself teaching remote viewing classes, the types of experiences people have had, and they feel comfortable sharing with me, that it's pretty clear that the version of reality that we were all taught in school, it's not like it's wrong, it's just incomplete. There is just a lot of other phenomena out there, and it's important that we discover this and investigate. I've had a subscription to Science magazine since around 1990 or 1989, since one of my graduate advisors recommended, oh, you should have a subscription to Science. There's always, one or two sociology type articles per issue. I don't see any treatment of the subject matter. It's so rare even to see a letter having to do with any of this. In 30 years of, it's a long time, 35 years of reading that magazine, I'm waiting for them to have a serious article about Bigfoot, cryptids, UFOs. I haven't even heard them mention remote viewing. I mean, Targan Putoff, who ran SRI at Palo Alto, they had an article there, I think in 73. I was only 10. They had an article in Science magazine about anomalous perception or something. That's a long time ago. So I think we're going to see an explosion of interest in these topics because younger scientists are curious and they don't want to be told, oh, no, you can't study this. You won't get your grant. You won't get tenure. It's like people have been blackmailed into not talking about this. And that's not even talking about all the people that have worked for the federal government who've signed NDAs who would like to talk to us, but they can't because they signed these these are draconian NDAs. You are not allowed to mention crash retrievals, and who knows what they have with Bigfoot cryptids. They have to know about this with the amount of land that the federal government manages in the US. What is it? 30% of the land is federal government. It's a lot. BLM, National Forest, National Park Service, huge amounts of land. There are probably many special access programs just for Bigfoot cryptids. I can't see how there wouldn't be. given the amount of contact their own federal workers who work in those lands must be having from time to time.
Going back to your comments that you just made, so who would be overseeing, any guesses as far as department, with the Department of Energy constantly coming up
Yeah.
as far
Yeah.
as the Invention Secrecy Act looking into the UFO phenomena? If Sasquatch is so similar to the idea of a UAP or a UFO, they can do similar things. Just look at the very end of A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot. Bigfoot turns into a box of light and a shaft of light and rockets off into the woods. Very similar to what happened in Close Encounters. So, have you either A, remote viewed some of these questions about who's pulling the strings, or any guesses, or have you been told not to talk about it, Simeon?
No, I've
We
never
have to
been
go on a
told not
skip.
to talk about it. I would never go down that route. It's not who I am. It's, we have to talk about it. It's our job. And I always tell people, if I can't talk about it publicly, don't tell me. Because it's our job to keep the fire of the public's imagination going. That's what creates new stuff and new ideas, and it's really what makes the economy go in the end, right? It's what keeps it's the engine of the economy is creativity, finding new ways. Isn't that what we're known for as Americans here, at least for those of us here in the US, of this kind of American ingenuity? What happened to that? Because it means we're not afraid to tackle new topics. And no, who's involved, who's involved with it. We have all these documents here and there that show us that the government is aware of some of these contacts that people have with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and there seems to be a policy, at least there has been in the past, from people I've listened to describe their stories, Forest Service workers. They're pretty much all told that we don't talk about that here, right? And if you talk about it, you'll lose your job. So there seems to be these kind of threats, and it really seems it's just it's too bad that it happens that way because, one, these people have nowhere to go to share their stories. And if we do share our stories together, then we find out, as Jill was saying before, what they have in common. It's really the first step, is to realize the experience you had out there. Other people have had the same experience. You read about these encounters and people feel so lonely from the encounter. It splits up friendships right then and there because people are so hesitant to talk about it. And this can happen with UFO sightings too. They never want to see each other again. Or one person says, I'm just not going to talk. I don't want to talk. I don't ever want to think about it. Because, you've researched enough of these encounters. Some of these encounters can go in a violent direction, or at least the people are really afraid and frightened by the way that these entities present themselves in a situation where people feel very vulnerable, like in a tent or in a camping situation. And they suffer a type of PTSD. So the way we get over that is we actually share and we talk. And it's been challenging because the people who've had contact with it are often afraid of the consequences for their job. And other people are afraid of their reputations, since that's very important to all of us.
Mhm.
So there's this sort of a lot going on there. And it again, I just don't think we can keep it. I don't think these things will remain under the covers that long, because it's just what happens when you suppress a topic long enough. It's just going to be that much more powerful, I think, when people start sharing the and they're doing that. We can see it right now going on. It's a really amazing thing to hear all these stories, all these different podcasts and shows that talk about this. It's quite a you could excuse me, you could spend all day just listening to these cases. They're so fascinating.
Jill, one of the better numbers that we have on YouTube is the live stream that we did up in Medellin Falls with Simeon Hein. And I think it points to a type of readiness that this audience has for dense subjects like this.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit of a risk, Simeon, for Brett and Jill to put this kind of dense science in a Bigfoot conversation.
Yeah, I
But
know.
We
the
had to.
response has really been there, right? Like you see it when you go to these conferences, people are kind of
Yeah.
blown away that there is this hidden event of science, a different type of science that's been compartmentalized. So I just want you both to respond to that.
If I can say really quick, we had to put this in, and not only did we have to like put in Simeon talking about the science. Can we see Astro?
Yeah,
Is Astro
give a
there?
shout out to, he's feeling ignored.
The most
Simeon has a
adorable
beautiful
dog
dog.
in the world.
He needs some relic nutrition, Simeon.
This is my emotional Squatch animal. He's my ESA.
I've got one too, by the way. Not as cute, but
My emotional Squatch animal. He's been trained
yeah.
to detect Squatches out there, to warn me ahead of time so I can get my camera out and my tape recorder.
Perfect.
And we can get some evidence. Right, Mr. Astro?
Right.
And you guys met him when he was just 6 months old. So now he's a year and a half. He's 2 years.
That's right. And just to throw this in really quick, at in Forks, we were doing an interview. Brett, Mike, and I sat down with Simeon, and I was in charge of Astro, holding him on the leash. It could not have gone worse. Like, we're having this serious conversation. All of a sudden, here comes this dog creeping in and like licking my face. But
He likes you, Jill.
what can I say? People love dogs. So, but I just want to circle back and say, we thought it was so necessary, not just to touch on the science, but really do a deep dive and put it out there. And we knew some people would struggle with it. People, I mean, some of the comments were like, why are we talking about all this science? It's like, we have to address this, because so many times people say, show me the science. Prove to me, use science to explain how this is happening, all this paranormal. Well, here it is. And we're not only are we going to present it to you, we're going to give you a little bit extra to think about. And then some.
Yeah.
So
No, and I really respect you for doing that. You took a big risk by putting that material in there. But, you know, people who've been in that field, I mentioned Takeaki Matsumoto, the Japanese, you know, nuclear science researcher that became interested in cold fusion LENR. He was banned from publishing in the US because he mentioned ball lightning. He felt that the explanation for cold fusion LENR was micro ball lightning. And you could see it. You showed some of it in the film, those little underwater spark discharge experiments, and you could see the little lightnings moving up. He said that's the same as this bigger ball lightning, another controversial subject that hasn't been a lot of agreement about, and you know, but it's been studied since the 50s by the Air Force. You can see the trail of research, the evidence going all the way back to Winston Bostick, Tesla. It's there in all this classified Air Force research. Half of the documents are redacted. So Matsumoto says, maybe it's the same thing. I'm seeing these little lights moving and it's creating excess heat. So even he was not allowed to publish because he mentioned ball lightning. So the whole kind of tradition that I was coming from, it in and of itself has come up against a lot of resistance. So for you to put that in the film, I just want to say thanks again for taking the risk to do that, because it's a whole tradition of research that has been repressed on the surface, but underneath you see there's all this classified research going on in it. It doesn't make it's like this paradox, you know. Outwardly it's ridiculed, but at the same time, defense contractors are getting patents in it. It's really two-faced. And by bringing it forward, we could see, hey, this is a whole line of scientific inquiry that matters, and it may have something to say about our topic here.
And just to mention, do you remember, Simeon, at Phenomicon, the day after we did our screening of the sequel, at the booth, an older gentleman comes up and he looks at me and he's kind of smiled, nodded, looked away, looked back at me and said, "You got the science right." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's Dr. Simeon Hein right there." He's like, no. He's like, "I'm a plasma scientist." And he worked at whatever labs. I'm sure you remember more than I do, but he's
Yeah,
like,
he
he
was a
just kind of,
plasma scientist for DOE.
yeah.
And he was talking to us, and he said, yeah, that totally makes sense, what you put together in the film. And I
He
was
was
talking,
giddy. He was giddy about it, kind of like, oh, some pedestrians
brought
know
it
what we're
up,
doing.
something that probably he couldn't talk about, and here it is in the film. And we did it without breaking any laws or violating any national security acts, because it's all in the open literature. But we just were able to put it together and say, hey, maybe the orbs and the anomalous lights that people see around Bigfoot and cryptid have something to do with the family of phenomena called ball lightning, and that whole range of coherent matter. So we were just kind of putting some of the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle. And I think for him, his name was David, right? It was very gratifying to see something he had probably known about for decades, but the general public had no clue about self-organizing plasmas and that whole range of subjects that we believe is connected to Bigfoot and cryptids, which is why people see all these interesting lights. And in Paranormal Bigfoot, right at the end, the final two witnesses, Cody and Harold, which is something I still think about so much. It's such a mind-blowing episode in that movie that everybody has to see this. You have these witnesses that literally see a Sasquatch turn into a ball of light, and then a square of light as bright as the sun, they said, looked like a miniature sun. And then it shoots off into the forest. And they weren't even Bigfoot, enthusiasts. They weren't even, it wasn't really their thing, but here they see it just driving around one day, two witnesses at the same time. So again, it was just the perfect witness to show us that what we were talking about theoretically, there are people who've actually seen it. The
And
definite connection from a ball lightning type thing to a Bigfoot.
and just to piggyback on what Harold and Cody experienced, I was contacted, I guess this was like about a month ago, by someone in Florida, no interest or connection to Bigfoot at all. And he saw something very similar happen on the beach that went shooting out over the ocean. And
Wow.
it just opened his mind. And then by some strange happenstance, Harold and Cody's video popped up in his YouTube feed. And he reached out. He's like,
Wow.
I
Is
saw
that
this.
right?
I understand. Like, I
Oh,
need
yeah.
to talk to these guys. And yeah.
Yeah, folks, if you don't think this is real, you need to see. Fortunately, the Resonance Productions people put up, they took that amazing segment of Harold and Cody and they just put it up separately on YouTube. You could just watch them talk about it. It is mind-blowing. Because you wonder, Jill, just like this witness, you're saying, how many other people have experienced this? And they didn't even know how to talk about it. So by putting it in A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot, it gave a language, a vocabulary to some of the experiences people have had, right? And you could say, oh, that's what people call ball lightning. This is coherent matter. It's related to plasmas. It's one of the types of matter. It just puts it in this framework of things we already know about and extends it, which makes it, I think, a little easier to talk about it. And then other people will say, wow, I experienced something like that too. Because how many times, I've been going to these conferences since I met you. I've been interested in these types of conferences. And, I met a witness in Kalispell at the conference up there a year ago. And this person said, I've never been to a conference before, any conference. So I said, what made you want to come to a Bigfoot conference? And she said, I saw one go invisible at my grandparents' property in Montana when I was a teenager. My dog also saw it. The dog was taken aback. And she said it was the exact description that Igor Burtsev had talked about with one of his witnesses in a Moscow garden. A curtain of light came down. She said pixelated. And it disappeared in this pixelations of light. And I don't know if you even ever told anyone before. It was just astounding. Can you imagine someone telling you this? And this is their first conference in their whole life, and that's why they came. They wanted to share that experience, and they told you. And so how many other people have experienced this and don't even know where to start. So that's how
That's
we
right.
start, is we have a discussion. We tell people it's okay
Mhm.
to talk about this and give a kind of vocabulary to the whole thing, right? So we can begin a larger discussion, because who knows where this is going to lead. It could lead
Mhm.
to really exciting new discoveries and types of energy and connection to other life forms out there
Mhm.
that have been hiding from us. Maybe they won't want to hide so much. We were joking around in Medellin Falls. Remember when we did the broadcast and I said we need to get one of those squatches right up here at the table and ask them. Maybe that'll happen sometime. Maybe they won't be the strangers that they've been. They'll see us as kind of being somewhat interesting, not
Damn, I
just
hope we
something to
get
throw.
that interview.
Yeah, we'll get the scoop on that one.
Yeah. How about that? No, but it could, just imagine that it could happen once we understand a little
Mhm.
more what makes them tick, or some
Mhm.
aspect of their experience that, if people don't even talk about it or they don't remember it, it doesn't give them much of a way to relate to us, because they could be showing up quite a bit. And I've been reading these encounters where people say they actually forgot about their encounter by the time they got home. It was only a friend or a spouse that reminded them. They'd already pushed it out of their minds. So if we expand the conversation, and I think this is happening right now, even with the drone phenomena in New Jersey, whatever those turn out to be, if we ever figure it out. I don't think we
Mhm.
figured it out in Eastern Colorado. I went out there and talked to people. It's hard to even talk about it if you don't. So we don't have the language. We call it a drone. That's the closest approximation, even though there's no evidence so far that they're drones. Maybe they're
Mhm.
closer to UFOs or some other type of technology. But once we get the discussion going, it's good, because we begin to look at all the possibilities. I just think that's very healthy. Could it be this? Could it be that? And then experiences come up that people realize they haven't talked about. And that's where we need to go with this, because I think if you did some research, you'd see a lot of people have had some experience with some of the phenomena that we're talking about here tonight in some way, but maybe they never shared it with anyone, or it was just too strange or scary or something. So
You bring up drones, but that's not the only thing that's been described in Bigfoot areas, because drones have absolutely been described in Sasquatch areas, but other terms like beams or rods or shafts, chandelier, which actually was confirmed early this year as like an official UAP word, that was described to us circa 2017. Tic Tacs, boxes of light, also in Bigfoot areas. But let's go back to these drones here. Um, could this be related to a cryptid event also unfolding? Because it's not too far away from like the Point Pleasant community. There's already this idea of cryptids out that way. So, what do you think's happening, Simeon, with the drones?
I don't know for sure exactly what they are, but I can tell you a lot of them don't act like drones. They don't seem to have any controller that could be jammed with the typical EM jamming weaponry that the military has available to them. We're told they're immune to that. Apparently, there are special forces designed to neutralize drones, and it hasn't worked so far, according to what I've heard. The funniest explanation I've heard so far is that some company invented a flying car, and they're doing this to show off their product. Uh,
Of
However,
course.
why would you pick military bases and reservoirs and really sensitive installations, nuclear power plants and things, to fly your flying cars around and commit all these, you I took private pilot ground school once at the University of Arizona. I got interested in flying. I didn't have the money as a graduate student to do the actual training, which was about $100 an hour. And you needed I think like quite a number of hours to qualify as a pilot. But I went through the ground school and I passed that. And I learned even there that if you go anywhere, over a military base, a controlled airspace, a practice range, you could have like a jail sentence. Okay. This was kind of instilled in our minds, that there are maps, and we had these maps, and this is, you can't go here and you can't go there. You have to ask for permission to go in here, right? All this. So, I mean, there's really law around this that's not being followed. And so I'm kind of unnerved by the fact that we're being told that these aren't any sort of threat or danger. But I mean, how do you know? And I talked to a witness in New Jersey. I know people in New Jersey, and they put me in touch with people that had seen these. And this woman said it was the size of a car, one of them, and the other type was a lot smaller. The car-sized ones were higher up. But just think anything the size of a car in the air that's not under FAA control. We're not talking about little DJI drones and things that we're all familiar with, whose maximum speed, I think, is around 35 miles an hour. It's going really fast, and it's not going to stay up there forever. This is something the size of a car. And how that can't be considered dangerous to have these flying around with no FAA control. I mean, any of those that hit anything could do a lot of damage. It could hurt, and it could cause injury. So I'm kind of surprised by the lackadaisical response from the federal government so far over something that could cause serious injuries, could cause collisions with aircraft, right? Which has always been the concern with UAP and UFOs. And we had Jay Stratton at Phenomicon this year in Vernal talk about how expensive it is to have these UAP up there interfering with practice exercises, when to, an F-16 costs something like $25,000, $30,000 an hour to have up in the air and do the practice. And if those practice exercises are interrupted, it ends up costing millions of dollars when they've planned this all out and all the preparation. And then they have to scrub the exercise because I forget what they call them, something range spoilers or something. They're spoiling the practice range because so this is a pretty lackadaisical response. So you keep hearing from these governors. A friend of mine just wrote me, who came back from Texas. The Texas governor said there's not a threat. You don't even know what they are. So I'm not saying things are automatically a threat, but anytime there's something that big flying around your area that isn't under anyone's known control, there could be risks of collisions, and who knows what they're doing. Why are they hanging out over reservoirs? That doesn't give me a good feeling particularly. So I mean, just to answer the question, this person said they saw smaller ones, but they were over her house all night, and it's interrupting her sleep. They're not as loud as ordinary drones that we're used to, but they do make some noise, and it's just up there going back and forth over the street all night until 5 a.m. And she said, I just went back to sleep. I have to sleep at night. So it's interrupting people's, that idea that we have with property ownership called quiet enjoyment. That's the name that's given for how we can use property around other people. Is it called peaceful enjoyment? Something like that term. This is not respecting that idea at all. It's just doing whatever it wants. It's annoying people. And it's striking how similar this is to the drones in eastern Colorado. I went out there a couple of years ago before we met, to Lyman. And I talked to people out there, and everyone knew someone who had seen these so-called drones. But, at the end of the day, people were convinced they were drones. They could have been UFOs. And Marquise Rennenkampf, I think his name is, that reporter in DC who used to work for the State Department. He found out the same object showed up in the 1960s over eastern Colorado. Same sort of objects 50 years ago.
Wow.
Is that drones, or is that some other intelligence occasionally saying, hey, here we are, kind of getting us acclimated in some way to their existence? It raises a lot of questions. And I think, again, just to sum it up, we call them drones because that's the closest thing that we can identify them with, but they stay up for what kind of batteries do these things have? I want batteries like that. Is it some advanced technology,
Simeon, when you say eastern Colorado, would that be near the San Luis Valley area?
No, the other side.
Okay,
the other side of the state towards Kansas, Nebraska, where
San Luis is more central, correct?
Yeah, it's more central. And I was at a conference there about animal mutilation, Snippy 24.
Yeah.
I
think Brett sent you to go look at some land or something, or we talked about it.
Yeah, down by Alamosa.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's central Colorado. This is on the eastern side, and it happens to be where the missile systems that are controlled by Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, have their missiles in that same area of southeast Wyoming, southeast, northeast Colorado, Nebraska are all those missile fields. The Minuteman missiles that are still there, controlled by Warren Air Force Base. So it's another.
Shocking. Just kidding.
No, yeah, it's just well, it was never explained, and even the internal Air Force emails, when they got those from a FOIA release, they said we don't know what these are. You could see them joking, making UFO jokes, but they didn't know what they were either. The Air Force operators at Cheyenne Mountain and Colorado Springs at the bases there, and Cheyenne Warren, they didn't seem to know what they were from their own internal emails. So I would have to say that if there are extraterrestrial types of intelligence, this could be, and they want to interact with us, this could be how you start. Is you have objects that the humans can identify with, so it's not too scary, right? They're drones. They don't just look like weird plasma entities floating around. They have some structure, because some of these ones seen in New Jersey, when I looked at it, they kind of look like planes, but they're a little off. And they're 100 feet over someone's house. You don't fly 37s over someone's 100 feet over the house. They had lights in the wrong places too.
Yeah.
It was like almost like AI had looked at the average of what planes look like and come up with something like some other civilization, said, let's put something there that's sort of what they're used to, but make it a little different, like to acclimatize us. This is one theory. If it really turns out to be some Air Force general's company that's going to sell flying cars, well, this person's going to go to jail for a long time for all the laws that have been broken. People have suggested it's foreign adversaries, but that's what we always tend to think. Oh, it's the bad guys, right? But do they really have the resources to do that over our airspace? I mean, I can't believe that those things wouldn't be taken down really quickly if that were the case. So it's possible nobody really knows what it is.
No, and they're pretty aggressive, Simeon. Like they're increasing in numbers, and it's happening right now. I was listening to one of the mayors talk. He said that there's actually kind of a schedule that people are looking at these things from like 7 to midnight, and that they come out as soon as the sun sets, and then they fly loops around or whatever. Now, are they doing any kind of transmedium? Anything? Is there a death-defying 90-degree turns? Is there anything like that?
Good question. They haven't been seen doing any of the 5 observables, which this is what ATIP, for those the viewers, this is what OSAP ATIP came up with, these 5 observables that define UFOs, UAP, what they're called now. Like transmedium travel and sudden acceleration and all these different characteristics. I haven't memorized all of them, but you've heard people talk about them. And they haven't shown that characteristic, but there was a family that said one came over their car and the clock changed time as the object was over. The digital clock displayed another time, and as the object left, it went back to the correct time.
Well, we're back here. We had a little bit of a tech issue, unfortunately, for Jill Remensnyder, who won't be with us for these last few minutes here, going into discussion, Simeon, about how when a drone passed over, the clock radio actually adjusted its time. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. That was a story from a couple in New Jersey that said one of these so-called drones went right over their car, and as it went over the car, the clock displayed the wrong time, and then as it passed away, the time went back to what it should have been. So it seemed to have affected the electronics of their vehicle. in some way, which is the first report that we have heard of this for a car that I've heard about. Yeah.
Well, there seems to be ongoing reports of houses, their house lights, the city lights, cars and car lots that are also blinking their lights on and off. I mean, it's very Roy Neary-esque as far as what's happening, right? At the train tracks, you're getting the same kind of feeling of something, you know, that's not a car behind him as it rises up into distance. So that's kind of interesting.
Right. I've seen those videos too. You're referring to people seeing entire parking lots of cars with the lights blinking in a strange way in some of these areas. And we are recording this a couple days later, so we do have more information, and people have reported some of these effects. Some of the civilian drone operators that have sent up their drones to see if they can get close to these objects have reported that their batteries have drained. I've seen 2 cases of this, people talking about it on their real, hobby drones have drained instantly and just falling from the sky. So whatever these objects are, they do seem to have non-ordinary electromagnetic effects that we definitely would not associate with ordinary types of drones that you and I would buy at the store.
In closing here, Simeon, this may take us a second to unpack,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
the last question I have for you has to do with the classification on the government level of what Sasquatch can do, also these UFOs can do. And that goes to the Department of Energy, perhaps, because one of the more interesting theories I've heard about what's going on with these drones is that they're low to the ground because they're sniffing something. Now they're sniffing nukes, they're sniffing whatever. But what this guy was theorizing, that just like if you were looking for Sasquatch, they're sniffing for these plasmoids. They're looking for where things have been embedded in these cities here because there's an imminent arrival that's happening now. And so they're keeping track of that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, in fact, this is something that I've been considering for a few days here, is that there is some very interesting parallels between this discussion we've been having about Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and some of the strange electromagnetic effects around Bigfoot, cryptids, also obviously having been seen around UFOs for decades, orbs, strange electromagnetic effects, clocks, watches stopping, batteries getting drained, and so forth. And then you start thinking these drones are causing some of the same effects. It's got me wondering in the direction of your question, whether all of these types of technologies, types of life forms are working from a different set of technological, energetic, biological principles than we're used to, a kind of a shadow side of energy that works more along a condensed matter type of paradigm, where when you really bring matter very close together, you get these very interesting, attractive forces that create nucleosynthesis and very interesting energy effects, excess heat, interesting gravitational effects. I'll just leave it at that, which puts it into a whole nother class of phenomena that we haven't had much of a discussion about, we haven't experienced very much. And it's often considered to be in the realm of, paranormal and so forth. But what if what we've been considering to be paranormal, supernatural is just another type of energy system structure, which can be eventually developed, packaged, and put into something the size of a drone,
Right.
and would account for energy that goes beyond the typical half hour you get with the type of drones that you and I could buy, into something that we're told can stay aloft for 6 or 7 hours at a time, not make very much noise. Are we dealing with one of these sort of advanced type of reactors that we, would think of as cold fusion, LEN, or low energy nuclear reaction? It's certainly something that I've been wondering about, given our discussion that we've had about Bigfoot, cryptid types of EM effects, which, again, as we said earlier in the interview, this isn't something that was even considered a couple decades ago. When witnesses would talk about it, it would be stripped out of their stories on some of these websites that have the different geographical locations where these encounters happened and so forth. So it really raises the question, Toby, if we're getting to the point where we're starting to consider that as something that's real, given that we're seeing it in the skies over New Jersey, New York right now, and many other locations in the US, it's shutting down airports, military airports, civilian airports. Pilots are as we've heard, are having to avoid these objects as they come in on their final, leg landing and so forth, taking off. So in a very interesting way, what's coming out of this is making us consider other types of science and technology that we might have thought of as being fringe. And all of a sudden, here it is, it's gone mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in closing, Simeon, how do you think this turns out as far as the timing of it? We don't really even need to go there. It seems like there's a power vacuum going on in DC. But what's the end game here? Do you have any idea, any predictions? Can you go cliff high on me and tell me what's going to happen?
None of us really know exactly what's happening, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that this has some sort of terrestrial source of black budget technology that has been in the making for decades and it's probably been developed, but because it's been hidden in black projects, isn't something that we've really had very much access to or really had very much public discussion about. And so when it sort of shows itself this way, and I think these objects really show some sort of advanced technology, some sort of advanced platform here, that it's like the Sputnik moment. It's definitely a leapfrog ahead of our typical combustion engines, batteries, and so forth that we're used to. It shows us that these types of technologies have been in development. Assuming these are terrestrial-based objects, that this technology has been in development for a while. And then it really makes you wonder, you got to ask the question, well, if this sort of technology has been there and it works, and we can see it working in front of our eyes, and it can go faster than some of our planes that are chasing these objects, I believe has happened over in Lakenheath a week or two ago, one of the air bases where they were chasing one of these objects, and it was faster than an F-16. If this type of technology exists, well, what other sort of developments exist that, we've been told is just, fringe science, junk science, pathological science, but it actually is highly developed energy technologies that work, and we're seeing demonstrations of that right now. So where I think it could go is to a very interesting important realization that there are other technologies that exist beyond the types that we're used to, that have been around for a while, that power our cars and our airplanes. There's something much more advanced than that we could be developing and we could use to, have more efficient energy generation, more environmentally friendly energy production and so forth. So it could really indicate a really big sea change in technology and the way we use energy.
Don't forget to pick up Simeon's books here, Opening Minds, A Journey of Extraordinary Encounters, Crop Circles, and Resonance. Also, his other book, Planetary Intelligence, Steps to Energy and Well-Being.
Well-being and Natural Insight. Yeah, about chi, natural energy, developing, yeah.
You came back with another edition, a second edition of Black Swan Ghost, a sociologist's encounter to witnesses to the unexplained aerial craft and the occupants and their elements in the multiverse. And of course, we found you over here at Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptids, Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Lifetime. Simeon, I appreciate you doing this, coming on board with us and taking the time to talk this here. We did have a little bit of a technical glitch, but we got it all figured out. I know your boots on the ground. You're on the East Coast. Things could get interesting on your way back as well. So you have a good evening, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Toby. We'll talk soon.
This has been a Resonance Production podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can email us at bigfootrevealedpod@gmail.com. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe for weekly podcasts coming up in the future. If you're just discovering the Flash of Beauty universe, you can watch our documentaries on most streaming platforms.